Hello and welcome to the Horizon podcast, the podcast that brings you insight from industry specialists and business leaders who have the knowledge, skills, and experience to help you trade internationally. Today, we're focusing on the current state of shipping and, importantly, what you as a business need to be aware of. Believe me, there is an awful lot going on at the moment, and there's a lot for us to cover. So, enjoy the show. Hello, and thank you for joining me. I'm your host, Ben Bradford, and it is my pleasure today to be joined by Anne Hall, Director and Shipbroker at Douglas Maritime. Thank you for joining me today, Anne, because we need, to be honest, your experience and expertise. Because, as I mentioned right at the beginning, shipping is in a very interesting place right now. So it's great to have you here to tell us a bit more all about it. So thank you very much. But important kind of first question. How are you doing today? And on the back of that, can you just explain maybe to people who aren't aware what exactly is a shipbroker?
Yes. Hi, Ben. Thank you very much for having me today. And hello to everybody listening. I'm Anne from Douglas Maritime. We are shipbrokers in Newcastle. So for anybody that doesn't know what a shipbroker is, we work with cargo owners who want to move cargo, import, export, match them up with vessel owners, operators that have ships that can carry that cargo. And we work to try and find the best ship for the best cargo and help broker and negotiate the terms and conditions of that carriage of contract. We do things ranging from steel pipes, fertilizer, cement, fuel, all sorts of different cargoes, cranes, and um, all sorts of projects. Hopefully that gives a
No, it
sim-
does. And I think it sets the scene very nicely of kind of the wide variety of products that you see and you help move kind of across the world. Um, and I'm sure what you see a lot of, because I know businesses talk to us a lot about it's always the cost of shipping. And to be honest, usually if someone's coming to us to complain about cost, it is because they are complaining. People don't normally come and go, wow, that was cheaper than I thought it was going to be. But I don't think a lot of businesses potentially appreciate kind of what is behind the cost. Maybe they just see kind of a number and think, right, get it from A to B. That's kind of all it is. But can you kind of give us a bit of a breakdown from your experience from working with the ships and what impacts this cost and kind of what factors make up that shipping cost?
Yeah, good question. So moving goods by sea, as a vessel owner operator, there are sort of various inputs that make the total cost of running and operating the ship. Things like fuel, which in the shipping industry is referred to as bunkers, dates back to sort of steam ships and having coal. But yeah, so we call the fuel that you use bunkers. Um, that's a big expense. Obviously, the crew to operate the ships, insurance costs, maintenance costs, the cost of calling each port. When a vessel comes into a port, often you need a pilot to get on board, might need tugs to help them maneuver. Um, they all carry a cost. Uh, if the Depend on the voyage, you may go through Suez Canal, Panama Canal, they have an extra cost. Um, so there are a lot of variables that go into the cost of running a ship and doing a voyage from A to B. Many of those costs increase. So kind of obviously we know from our own experience, kind of wages are rising, probably not as fast as employees want them to, but generally wages are increasing. So obviously that's reflected. Crew costs increase over time. Um, the fuel costs, you see on the petrol stations, if there's an instance such as crisis in the Middle East, then often oil prices escalate, you pay more for your petrol. Well, that's the same. Ships have to pay more for their fuel. So that can all factor it. But one of, I guess, the big things with shipping is ultimately it's sort of supply and demand driven. So when demand increases for shipping, the freight rates that you are paying will go up. However, when demand drops back, freight rates or the cost that you're paying for containers, if you didn't buy containers rather than chartering the full ship, then those rates drop. So, and that can fluctuate. So, kind of in recent times, there's been quite a few changes. You may recall, unfortunately, a strong memory in everybody's minds, the horror of COVID. Sort of in the as COVID first sort of kicked off in the initial lockdowns, obviously that caused a very immediate impact on shipping because very little was moving. So in the very short term, freight rates dropped. However, that they fairly quickly increased as sort of everybody was ordering things from sort of Amazon and bringing in sort of, garden furniture and things and more consumer goods. And then obviously as things reopened, there was all that pent up demand. So um, your container charges went up a lot, and the costs for chartering a vessel if you wanted to move goods from A to B and needed to charter a ship, there was a big increase. We worked with a client who pre-COVID sent a cargo from Europe to South America on a charter vessel, so a full ship, and maybe paid about $300,000 for a small ship. Post sort of in the midst of just after COVID, it was double that. So it can change quite quickly. And then sort of likewise, if demand stays the same, but there's a change to the supply side, so you might have at the moment a lot of ships are routing via Cape of Good Hope around sort of South America because of issues in the Middle East. So that route is taking longer. So that affects your sort of supply. The ships are taking longer to do the same voyage. So that in effect is sort of a constraint on supply. Therefore, it can affect. There's no change to demand necessarily, but the rates can change because supplies contract. If that makes sense.
No, it makes perfect sense. I think it breaks down kind of perfectly what's involved, and I think that bit on supply and demand just shows how um explains how it can be volatile, I suppose. And it's not just kind of your fuel, it's not just in terms of like your days at sea and the likes, and your staff costs. Um I suppose being
Yeah,
an
I guess.
excellent go on.
Oh, sorry, just quickly. I guess one way of
Yeah.
thinking about it is, I guess it's similar, Uber. So if anybody
Mm,
went to Sam Fender the other week in Newcastle and tried to get a taxi after the concert, the rates for Uber were, like triple what you would also pay for a fare. Um, because obviously there's such a high demand, but only a limited number of vehicles. So it's similar in shipping. If there's a real strong, if demand is really strong, the the fleet of vessels available, whether that be container ships or general cargo ships, you're limited. So as soon as demand gets to a point, all freight rates will just go up and up and up. But the flip side is when demand is lower, then it drops.
yeah. I like that Uber analogy. That's a good one, that one. So I suppose on that, with like supply and demand, obviously it can depend on instances, kind of what's happening here and now. Um, Seasonal as well. How does kind of seasons, if you think about, obviously we think about Christmas as just December, but if you're kind of shipping internationally, you're obviously getting prepared long before kind of I do my Christmas shopping, which is kind of last minute. So how does seasonal kind of impact that kind of supply and demand?
Yeah. So again, it depends, but yeah, obviously, sort of that affects container lines, but it also affects general cargo. So traditionally, summer is normally quieter because for various reasons, and then it picks up again in the autumn, as people are sort of getting ready for Christmas and things like that. But also in the autumn, obviously you've got harvest, so like grain cargoes and things, there's lots of movement as a result of that, which increases demand. Also in sort of autumn, there's become stronger demand for fuel, so that
Right.
impacts so um not that we use coal in the UK, but obviously there's other countries that use coal, so ships that are transporting coal, that demand can go up and things. So general as a general rule, sort of the winter is you tend to pay more in winter, I guess, than the summer. And partly as well in the winter, just things take longer. So there's generally more demand, but also um, the there are more issues to consider. So bad weather can slow everything down. So ships can get delayed on their voyages because of bad weather, but also within ports, you know, um, depend containers less of an issue because the boxes and they can move very easily and they're not weather dependent. Um, but if you're moving sort of bulk cargoes or other project cargo and you charter in a ship and the ship that it's going on was previously carrying a cargo of fertilizer or something that can only be loaded or discharged in dry weather, then that ship could get held up in port before it comes to load your cargo. So there's all those extra kind of risk factors and things that can affect costs, because if ships are taking longer to do a voyage, then owners sort of know that, so they build that into their calculations a little bit.
And that does a really good job of, I suppose, explaining and showing how, um, for businesses, yes, you've got to think about you and your product and what you're trying to move, but the whole kind of ecosystem that is shipping is an awful lot wider than you and your product. And you might think that, yes, I'm doing the same thing that I did 2 months ago, but because of impacts, wider impacts, whether that be weather, seasons, demand, whatever, can still kind of impact you and kind of your, I suppose, your little business.
Yeah.
On those kind of thing about like here and now, and there's a lot going on. You've already mentioned kind of how ships are still rather than kind of the Red Sea, looking at the Cape of Good Hope going around South Africa and the impacts of that. We've seen kind of the current issues and with Iran and the threats that are coming out of there, and I think saw kind of a press release from Maersk saying about whether they were or were not chartering through the strait. And then also you've got on top of that, you've got kind of US tariffs. We're still not totally sure kind of where they will finally settle when the dust does settle. But when you're talking about supply and demand, I imagine that those three kind of factors can have a pretty big and impact on you and what you do for businesses and the rates as well for shipping.
Absolutely, yeah, and it's it's a very interesting time at the moment, and as you say, sort of the things with America and Trump keeping everybody on their toes. With, I mean, he seems to be quiet at the moment. There seems to be a little bit of a pause. But yeah, when he announced his what was it, Liberation Day, he called it, and with with his big long list and chalkboard of all the tariffs, and then his sort of flip-flopping around that, and that has caused sort of quite a lot of uncertainty amongst people and people that we work with and deal with. And I think that, coupled with various other factors, has meant not just Trump, but that's one part of it. Quite a few people, I think, are pausing decisions in terms of what they're moving, where they're sending it to, what investments they're making, a sort of kind of wait and see approach to see if things level out. Um, and as overall, the freight market at the moment is quite low compared to what it was maybe 12 months ago, and definitely sort of 18 months ago. Um,
Right.
so if you do need to transport anything, um, it's sort of quite a good time in terms of costs for doing it generally at the moment, both in terms of container rates, but also charter rates if you need more space and on a part cargo or full sort of charter vessel. But yeah, so all the issues in the Red Sea with the Houthis, and yeah, that's caught some ships still sail that route and are taking the risk and going through the Red Sea. Others are still sailing via Cape of Good Hope. The It's rates are settled, so I think sort of looking at container rates the other day, it was something like $2,000-3,000 on average for a container from Asia to Europe, whereas last year it was probably double that, more sort of around about the 6,000. Um, but yeah, but it's still definitely still an issue, still a concern. The Thankfully, the Iran and Israel sort of conflict
Mhm.
sounded like at the very beginning you know, it could have quite
Yeah.
significant sort of repercussions. Um, it's, it seems to have quietened, but who can say? But the threats from Iran of, closing the Strait of Hormuz, then that could have had big ramifications for global shipping. I think something like 20% of the world's oil comes out of there. So obviously that would have a major impact on oil prices. I think I'm not sure if they would go ahead and do that if things did escalate, but who knows? We're living in uncertain times. That is something to sort of be conscious of and aware of. And kind of, excuse me, on the other side of that as well is some vessel operators, some container lines aren't calling it, say, Israel ports, because of the risks of calling there. And that seems to be changing fairly sort of fluidly as well. So there's all sorts of yeah, things to think about depending on what you're moving and where you're moving it to. Um, but yeah, they're all factors to be aware of.
Yeah, and I suppose essentially all that leads to is, kind of a bit of a volatile market. Um, and I suppose on that kind of, what would you say to businesses now in terms of um, what they can expect from prices and typical rates? For instance, um, I'm sure you'll have some businesses who maybe if they don't ship as often, can they really rely on whatever figure they paid 6 months ago or 2 months ago to give them kind of a ballpark figure as to what the cost is now? Or is the market so volatile that businesses really kind of just need to be taking it ev week by week or kind of every fortnight and not kind of have a too much of a reliance on what they've previously paid?
Yeah, I think at the moment things are changing. I think, if you had something for a week or two ago and a couple of weeks time, then, probably you'd be okay. But I think it's definitely worth maintaining good relationships with whoever you use for moving your cargo, whether that's with a freight forwarder, um, or if you use another vessel broker, depending on who you use, keep in close contact with them, uh, because they will be able to keep an eye on what they'll have their ear to the ground. They'll sort of kind of they'll have access to more rates and market intelligence, so they'll see how things are changing, um, and yeah, we'll know. So I would say it's best to keep in contact with those supply chain partners, and before committing to any sort of sale or agreements, just revisiting rates just to be sure that you're not exposed, and maybe have if you do a booking on a liner service, for instance, they have lots of things in their small print. So if fuel goes up by a certain percentage, then they can add on a fuel surcharge. If there's congestion in ports, um, then and they're waiting a long time to load or discharge a cargo, and container lines have a congestion surcharge. There's a thing called the EU ETS, which is people are probably aware of the emissions trading scheme. Well, at the moment in the UK, that doesn't affect maritime. It does for Europe. So any vessels over a certain size that come in and out of Europe have to buy sort of carbon allowances for the emissions on their voyages. There are plans to introduce a scheme in the UK that would only affect coastal shipping, so vessels of a certain size calling from one UK port to another.
Right.
However, the recent sort of UK EU agreement that was announced sort of earlier in the year,
Yeah.
that includes proposals to align the UK ETS schemes with the EU ETS schemes. So if that comes into force, then there will be the EU, our ETS scheme will mirror the EU's, and that would then mean if a ship's calling UK to EU or EU to UK, then all of the emissions for that voyage will sort of be subject to kind of this carbon tax. They'll have to buy carbon allowances uh, for those emissions on that voyage. Or if the vessel was going from UK to sort of non-UK port at like the US or for instance, then it's 50% of emissions would then be applicable. So, but I w- not 100% sure of the exact timescales for aligning the EU ETS with the UK ETS.
Yeah.
Uh, but all of those things are kind of potentially additional costs that could be factored in. So some carriers include it within their rates, but other carriers have it as sort of an extra surcharge. And again, let's say if the carbon price increases by a certain percent, um, and the carbon allowances become more expensive to buy, then the operators will probably have some clause in their fine print that says you claim a little fat back.
Pass the cost along.
Yeah, I guess, yeah, understanding the small print when you're doing it, and if possible, trying to have some kind of back-to-back conditions with your sort of customer as well to try and cover yourself if possible, but obviously that's not always possible or appropriate.
I think that does, well, what you said there, couple of bits pulling from it. Great job of kind of just explaining different surcharges and what they are. I think, people and businesses are probably used to seeing them and maybe go, "Oh, they just kind of stick them on," but, without kind of really having any knowledge of when they're introduced or why them surcharges are there. But also, I think kind of another point that you mentioned was that relationship with your shipbroker, freight forwarder, whoever that may be. Do you think kind of what businesses have been through, I suppose we'll go right back to kind of from beginning of COVID as well. Do you think if anything that's just highlighted even more that importance of having someone there that you trust, that you've got that relationship with, rather than necessarily taking it job by job basis and kind of shopping around and just booking whoever's kind of the cheapest out of the air, having that relationship is even kind of more important than ever?
Definitely, I think if you've got somebody that you trust, you can have those conversations with them. If you've got a good relationship, they'll probably they might give you a little bit more information or intelligence than if you're not than if you weren't known to them, and just sort of you've got that kind of loyalty and relationship. But then, and yes, they might be able to go the extra mile and may be able to put pressure on people that they work with, or you know, owners, operators. They might not be able to, but you know, if you've got that good relationship, you've got somebody else there that has a more direct channel to one of the operators that can try and, you know, see if there's any opportunity to improve things on your behalf.
So I suppose kind of last question for me, and sorry, because kind of pretty open. Um, but generally, kind of what advice would you give to business? Is there any advice on maybe how they can um, mitigate the costs, or at the very least, um, avoid that kind of nasty surprise of what you've been talking about in terms of surcharges? Um, what advice would you give any business nowadays who kind of ship internationally?
I guess the number one is, yeah, find a partner that you trust and that you can work with well, and that you can ask the questions of, and having somebody at the other end of the phone is always a help. Um, it depends on the nature of the cargo and, you know, the movements that you do is, but um, you know, if you're doing fairly regular business and it's of a scale where you need to charter a vessel rather than it's, you know, just putting it on containers. Um, if you need to charter a vessel, then there are options that people can look at in terms of uh, trying to agree contracts of affreightment with vessel owners, or requirement contracts where you have a framework in place, an agreed freight rate for agreed period of time and sort of quantities. Um, so then you know that you will get that price for each cargo that you ship during that period under that contract. Um, there might be factors where an owner would want a sort of bunker adjustment clause included, but at least then you're narrowing down the variables. Um,
Mhm.
you can be more confident in the rates that you're using. Um, but I think at the moment, because particularly of the sort of uncertainty in the Middle East, and um, seeing what level eventually is going to sort of um, come to at the US with sort of all of their tariffs and trade agreements and things, um, because there's still quite some uncertainty in all those regards. Um, I think for me, it would be a case of continually getting refreshed prices and rates before committing to any sort of sale or purchase, uh, that you sort of, yeah, that you try and do that. Uh, or if, you know, maybe look at the costs, and if it's better to get, if you're buying goods, if it's better to ask for the seller to give you the rate, including the shipping costs, and put the risk onto them. Um, so that you're, you know, you're clear on what the cost is. Maybe they might charge you more, but then you know that that is what you're paying. And likewise, if you're selling, you could, you know, instead of selling CFR, you could sell FOB, or, you know, change your,
Yeah,
if it's appropriate. It's not always an option. But yeah, at least then if you're not responsible for the shipping, it's more and less. This is it. Uh, Um,
you're right.
however, I guess at the moment, because freight rates are generally low, I think it's, if you are transporting anything, uh, it's, yeah, it's a good time at the moment. How long it'll stay low?
If you could answer that, then yeah.
Exactly. I'd be off on a beach somewhere. So so yeah, I think it's they're low at the moment, but you know, if whether they're going to go much lower, steady off, or start to gradually increase, or suddenly increase, I wouldn't like to say.
No, that's I think that's perfect, and that just kind of, like you said there are different options that businesses can consider. But I think key bits were having that relationship, conversation, and just have an ear to the ground in terms of getting those quotes. So hopefully, you don't have a that kind of nasty surprise as and when you need it. But I hope that's just, and I'm sure it has really opened people's eyes a little bit to the costs in shipping, kind of what's involved, and it's not just a case of, oh well, as simple as saying the price of petrol for me's gone up, so the price of petrol and shipping's gone up, or my price of petrol's gone down, so it must be cheaper to ship. There's an awful lot more involved, and there's a lot more that goes beyond just kind of your business and what you're shipping when you think about kind of the global supply and demand and the impacts and the effects that that has. So thank you very, very much for your time, man, today. I know it could kind of go on for an an awful lot longer, but kind of fantastic insights. So thank you very much for joining me. If anyone would like to speak to one, just kind of more about shipping or Douglas Maritime and how they can help you move your goods and offer kind of that shipbroker service, then please do contact Anne via her details in the bio below the podcast. Also, if you want to keep up to date with international trade news more widely, then again, you can follow the link in the bio to subscribe to our weekly newsletter, where you'll get all the latest news covered, but also the latest releases of the podcast series and Horizon magazine. But finally, a big thank you from me to you, the listener. I hope you have enjoyed today's podcast and you can join us again for a future episode. But until then, thank you and goodbye.